Pump up music there. Chicago Bulls, 1994 intro music. So we're going to try to make this quick. Path to Revolution. We've been talking about how the very different, disparate colonies in North America are making their way to fighting this revolution. So we're going to try to hit some more of the major causes. We've been doing this for the last couple classes. So remember, the last couple classes we've been putting together stuff from readings, from the quiz that we took. So let's French Indian War, Google Slide, G Slide. So let's keep going. Major questions: what events push colonists to support revolution? Let's do it. Go. Okay. Purposes of taxes. Pretty simple, right? Everyone hates them, but at the end of the day, we need tax money to pay for things like schools. You want to have a well-educated population. You want to have a productive population. You need a trained population. So you need schools. You need roads. You need bridges that work. You need water. You need to have infrastructure to move utilities like gas and electric. You need to pay for things like public transportation. You need to pay for military defense. You need to pay for people to retire when they get really old and help them out with Social Security. All kinds of reasons. You need taxes, right? Taxes allow governments to provide services to pay for things that citizens need. So remember that Britain has been trying to pay off their major debt from the French and Indian War and the Indian Wars on the frontier, like Pontiac's Rebellion, through taxes that they've placed on the colonies. Remember that the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act both fail because of the pushback, the anger. By the way, these are Sons of Liberties that are about to tar and feather English tax collector. You take boiling hot pitch, hot tar, you dump it on a person's bare skin, it melts to their skin, and then you dump feathers on them and parade them through the streets. Sometimes it would kill them. It's pretty bad. This is what happened to English tax collectors. Remember, England's like, okay, we can't do these taxes. It's causing too many problems. So next they try to do the Townshend Act. Remember, you read about this in your book. Don't forget that the book that we read oftentimes has information that will show up on the test. It's often important information, which is why I give you quizzes on it and allow you to take notes. But some of you still don't do. I don't know why. But anyway, it's different. That's a different subject. Townshend Act have to do with a bunch of imports or a tax on imported goods. So anytime England or any foreign empire country would bring in goods, there was an extra tax on those goods. Those are called imports, right? So you put a tax or a tariff on these imports. So who's going to suffer the most? Well, merchants that are buying these foreign imported goods and selling them to Americans are going to have to raise their prices. Sales are going to go down. Americans are trying to buy things like glass, lead, paint, tea, things like that. All this stuff is going to go up in cost and it's more expensive. So the people who are most angry at this point in time is New England and the merchants of cities on the East Coast like Boston. There's other cities, Philadelphia. Boston is sort of the focal point. And so the reason that merchants have so much power and why what happens to merchants impacts the economy and the colony so greatly. Look at John Adams, a lawyer in Boston at the time, who was talking about the relationship between the merchants and the rest of the workers in Boston. He said, quote, "All the rich men have many of the poor in various trades, manufacturers, and other occupations in life, dependent upon them for their daily bread. Many of the smaller fortunes will be in debt and in many ways under obligations to them." Break that down quickly. All the different people who work in various jobs, make different things, have different occupations, they are very much dependent on their daily bread. Daily bread meaning, the money that they bring in. And many people who have made businesses, who have started businesses, are all dependent upon the powerful merchant class. Let's look at this called chain of economy. So you have merchants. Merchants are the ones who pay a ton of money to own and operate these ships. A ship needs a captain, right? A captain's going to have to hire a crew, and there's going to need to be dock workers who work along the waterfront, transporting cargo on and off the ships. You're going to need coopers to make barrels, and the barrels are the major way that you would store all these goods. And then you need carpenters to build and repair. Plus, there was insurance companies, and there were other industries that were totally dependent on these ships bringing stuff in. The point being, if you take out the top of this chain, it all collapses, right? If you take out the merchants, the entire chain is broken and all of these guys suffer. Think about throwing a rock into a pond, and there's all those ripples. Major example, John Hancock. Maybe you heard of him. We'll talk a little bit more about him, but he's the guy who signs his name really large in the Declaration. So, anyways, John Hancock, richest man in Boston, one of the richest men in all of the colonies. Why is he so against the taxes? Well, he was wealthy because he was a smuggler. He made a living smuggling in tea, sugar, all kinds of items, and he had paid off all the English tax collectors. Remember, salutary neglect. No one really paid all that close of attention, so was he able to get away with just about anything? Okay, so his ship comes into port in Boston Harbor, and the British customs agents that he has paid off, that he's bribed, they come on board and they say, all right, looks like we've got 50 barrels of wine, so we're going to tax this ship through the Townshend Act for 50 barrels. Well, in reality, there were 200 barrels on the ship, but they looked the other way. They pretended like they didn't see it. So they're only paying about 1/4 of the actual taxes. Well, with the Townshend Act, one of the things that they do is they enforce these taxes, and a tax collector who wasn't paid off by Hancock goes on board and says, "Aha, I have discovered your ploy, and I know that you're trying to evade these taxes, and we're going to try to arrest you and shut down your business." The dock workers riot. Everyone rushes to the defense of John Hancock. Why? Well, he's a very, very important man, which that's one reason, but more importantly, his business employs and pays so many different people, and they're all dependent upon the economy. Hancock and this shipping operation, import operation, the trade of Boston is crucial to New England's economy. So, Massachusetts, as you might expect, gets pretty pissed off about this. They come out and reject the Townshend Act. Remember, just like Virginia's House of Burgesses rejected the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, the Massachusetts colony is going to send a letter to all the other colonies. However they do this, right, they're trying to build support. They say, look, no taxation without representation. We never agreed to this. If you force this tax on us, you're basically stealing our property, and we're going to fight back. So how do the British respond? They've had enough of Boston, and they shut it down by occupying it with some British soldiers. So as the British soldiers begin to flood into Boston, there's tension between the soldiers who are living in the city and the people of Boston. A few years later, after years of this building tension, the Boston Massacre breaks out. So quick backstory, the British soldiers were stationed all throughout the city, and a bunch of drunken teenagers would often harass them. And so one night after these drunken teenagers left the tavern, they start throwing snowballs with rocks inside of them. And eventually the British officer, a young man, gets sort of pissed off, and he calls out the guard. They bring their guns up and they point them, and the crowd grows larger, and they start throwing objects. Eventually someone yells fire, and one of the nervous British soldiers pulls the trigger. And as soon as one guy fires, everybody fires into the crowd. 4 people were killed, and it's a pretty defining moment. Now, from the British perspective, look, these are official soldiers enforcing the law, and they're being harassed and attacked by citizens. From the American perspective, this is a massacre by these brutish, militaristic occupiers, foreign occupiers. And so Paul Revere is going to capture the American perspective in a famous carving. That wasn't going to be in color, but they colorized it later, but you get the idea. Right? This was sent to all the colonies and newspapers, and all the newspapers printed the American perspective of these. You can sort of see the soldiers sort of aggressively firing into a crowd of innocents. You don't see any weapons or anything being thrown. All you see is blood on the ground. So after this is when that group that we talked about before, the Sons of Liberty, they send out a message throughout the city that now is the time to rise up, the hour of destruction, or manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny stares you in the face. So either it's time to put up or shut up. Either we're going to be destroyed, or we are going to oppose tyranny. Now's the time. And it leads to something called the Boston Tea Party. A few years later, tea, a very popular item. People in America haven't really switched to coffee yet. Tea's a lot cheaper, and it's seen as sort of more refined. You can still get a caffeine kick. I prefer coffee. Anyways, so about $600,000 worth of tea is in Boston Harbor, and the Sons of Liberty dress up as Indians, not because they thought anyone would confuse them as actual Indians, but they were trying to hide their identity. And they board these ships and throw basically the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars of tea into the harbor as a major act of defiance. So at this point, Britain has to do something. right? They have to continue to pay off these debts. They want the colonists, the Americans, to start paying their fair share. No longer does salutary neglect going to allow these Americans to do their own thing, run their own government. Instead, it's time to force the Americans to bend the knee, right? To acknowledge that their king and the parliament is in charge. So the prime minister, sort of the president, steps up and gives a speech, and he says, quote, "The Americans have tarred and feathered your subjects," which is true. "They have plundered your merchants." Boston Tea Party, also true. "They've burnt your ships." This is also true. There's acts of terrorism against British ships. "They've denied all obedience to your laws and authority." Yep, this is also true, right? The colonies wanted their own governments and didn't really want to listen to England. Yet so clement or understanding and forgiving has our conduct been that it is now important, it is crucial for us to take on a different course. Whatever may be the consequences, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over. What is Britain basically saying? It's time to crush this thing. So they passed a series of acts. Now, in America, they're called the coercive acts. The coercive, you read about it in your book. Remember, coercive means to force, to kind of force someone to do something against their will. Sorry. Britain called them the coercive acts because they were going to force the colonists to accept the rule. America, the colonies, called them the intolerable acts. They couldn't be tolerated. They couldn't be allowed to exist. What were they? Close Boston Harbor. That's going to destroy New England's economy. End all those town meetings. Remember, go back to our earlier Google slides. We talked about the importance of town meetings and government in the early Massachusetts Bay Colony and how everyone would get together and voice their opinions. Well, we're going to shut down local government. We're not going to allow these people to meet anymore. British soldiers would now be given private lodgings. In other words, they were going to go into citizens' houses. It's called the Quartering Act. They were going to go into private citizens' homes and say, basically, you have to give us a room to stay, you have to give us food, and you're going to have to do this because of the way that you've acted to us. Finally, the Quebec Act. Basically, remember, Quebec is in Canada, but Canada is a separate province from the American colonies. And what Britain said is, you know what, those Canadians, those Quebecians, we're going to give them all the Ohio Valley to rule, not the colonists, because the colonists can't handle it. They've become too greedy. So we're going to give all that prime rich land in the Ohio River to the Canadians. This leads to an outburst of something called nationalism. Think about Ben Franklin's Albany Plan of Union, that all colonies needed to join up or die alone. Join together or die alone. George Washington said the cause, he's from Virginia. George Washington, a powerful, rich man in Virginia, says the cause of Boston is now the cause of America. In other words, Boston is us. We are Boston. Patrick Henry, the guy who says, give me liberty or give me death, says, I am not a Virginian. I am an American, right? That's his identity. No longer is he a Virginian. Instead, he believes in the nation, this growing nationalism. So what is nationalism? It's a sense of shared culture, history, and it allows individuals in Virginia to feel the sameness with Boston, or people in New York to feel the same as those in Georgia, right? We all have this national identity. You could also think of it in a way as patriotism, right? You want to fight for your country. So, with this growing nationalism, representatives are going to meet. Representatives from all the different colonies are going to meet for the first time in Philadelphia in 1774 to form the first Continental Congress. Congress is a gathering, right? They're going to talk about what they should do next. But no longer are they going to act individually. They're going to act in a nationalistic, unified way. One of the things that starts to happen in the meantime is these militias, right? Private citizens that form their own militaries, their own militias. They were called Minutemen because they had to be ready in a minute's notice. They start stockpiling weapons and guns in case a war breaks out. The British find out about this and they march out into the countryside outside of Boston to confiscate all the weapons. Once they march out of Boston, you've probably heard of the famous riot of oh man, the Cardinals just went down 2-1. Crap. The famous riot of Paul Revere. Paul Revere, two if by land, one if by sea, right? So here they come. He sees the lanterns. He rides into the small towns throughout the rural parts outside of Boston and says, the British are coming, the British are coming. Everyone gets ready. The Minutemen ride out. And the first place that the British come across these militia is at a place called Concord, right? Lexington and Concord, out on the village square, the village green. And it's there that Ralph Waldo Emerson, about 70 or 80 years later, writes a famous poem where he says, by the rude bridge, the basic bridge, that arced the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, Here once the embattled farmer stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. Famous saying, the shot heard round the world, because this is the first shot of the American Revolution. So at Lexington, Concord, the 10 Americans are shot and killed, and the British feel like, hey, we've put down these Americans and showed them what's what. But here's the thing: when they march back to Boston, over 200 British soldiers are killed. Why? Well, one thing, they were called lobsterbacks because they had these red uniforms. They didn't blend in very well. They stood out. Whereas the Americans had very dun colors, very what we might call camouflage colors, and they fought a guerrilla-style attack against the British, sort of like the Native Americans did. They basically sniped them off one by one, and they would retreat back into the woods that they knew so well, and the British couldn't really pursue. And so really it's sort of this moment where the Americans show that they're willing to stand up. Okay, I would like to show you this perspective, the American perspective and the British perspective. It's pretty interesting about how different, you can look at it if you want, how different the Americans see it, and how the British see the attack, right? If we have more time to look at it, I'm kind of running out of time. So I'm going to pause it here and let you guys take over.